Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a fantastic. Excuse me. Ooh, had to sneeze there. Hope you're having a fantastic 4th of July approaching weekend. I've noticed many of you have been very busy submitting your surveys and hopefully doing your surveys for your classmates as well. Um, it was pointed out to me that I won't know if people have done your survey. I'm going to trust that you will, knowing that. There are about 18 active participants in the course, so you should each have about 18 responses. Um, Most of your survey responses are going to be anonymous. In fact, I think all of them are. I don't think a single one of you have asked the student's name, and that's fine. That's great. Um, so again, if you get close to 18 responses, that's good. If you're only getting like 3 or 4, that is a problem. So um, as the Sunday, as the weekend rolls on here, and you're maybe watching this on Monday or Tuesday, and hopefully Monday, you are going to let me know if you only have a handful of responses. We don't want this to drag on for too terribly long. So if we need to do some kind of encouragement to make sure people take the surveys, we will. But I did want you to be aware that I was aware that you wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't know unless you reported to me if people are doing their survey. So having said that, I am happy that people are doing their work. And that's what it seems like from my perspective. So I'm really happy about that. Let's go ahead and take a gander at the link for this video, and we'll post that up to you so you can see it. And then, yeah, we'll get there. Today we're going to talk about logical fallacies in your speeches. Oop, no, it was muted already. Okay, so here's the unique link to this video. Go ahead and put it up there. It's going to be a relatively short presentation, I think. Here's the linkaroni. And you'll probably hear my email go as soon as it goes in there. Okay. Yes, sir, indeed. Okay, email was sent to all course users. Awesome. And let's go ahead and just get started with the presentation. Yeah, so logical fallacies in you and your speeches. See, there's the email going across. Okay, so we have to move up. First of all, show you the presentation. There we go. So logical fallacies in you and your speeches. So this is going to cover kind of a little variety of topics. They're all I kind of file them under logical fallacies because what they are is they're errors in thinking, and really at the end of the day, at least when you use the term logical fallacy or fallacy colloquially, that seems to be what people mean. As we'll talk about in a moment, your textbook / a lot of experts kind of have a particular idea of what a fallacy is, but colloquially, when people talk about, I'm sure you're making a fallacy here, or that's a logical fallacy. They kind of mean something general, like you just committed a mistake in your thinking. So let's do some review first, though, because a lot of this requires that you kind of remember or are actively thinking about this argument model. Now, remember, when we say argument, at least for this class and for this speech, we're not really talking about raising your voice or fighting with somebody. We're talking about an argument is just kind of a persuasive, a unit of persuasive thought. Let's put it that way. It's a discrete unit with a persuasive thought. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And here those items are. The beginning of an argument is the claim. This is a statement that you want the audience to believe by the time you're done making your argument. Then you present data, which is evidence that you feel supports the validity or the truthfulness of your statement. And then you back that up with, and you conclude your argument with a warrant, which is reasoning linking these two items together, the data and the claim. And once you're done laying out that reasoning and kind of reminding why this data supports the claim, you've completed a full argument. All right, and then you can move on to the next one. So really, in this speech, I'm not requiring you to use the Monroe's motivated sequence. so much as I am saying that you need to have arguments. Remember when I went over your assignment details for the speech, like the time limits might have been a little bit longer, and the resources I want you to present were a bit longer, but you can really kind of make your arguments for or against whatever your topic is. Um, However you choose. You don't need to necessarily start with a need step or start with a or have a solution in there. But you should still be influencing us to persuade us to either do something we don't already do, to believe something we don't already believe, to arrive at a certain conclusion. Um, and you do that by making these arguments, all right, these three steps here. So that's what we're going to be thinking about today. So fallacies occur here. Um, so they occur in the warrant step, in the final step. But before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about maybe we can talk about it as evidence and its connection to your warrant, and that's this idea about fact versus opinion. And I call this whole little part here the fact versus opinion fallacy, because a lot of people have maybe a more accurate term for this would be a misconception. A lot of people have this idea that fact and opinion are actually in opposition to each other, that they're different ideas, um, and you can't really entertain a fact and an opinion. Like you either have an opinion or you have a fact, and they don't they don't mix together like oil and water. But facts and opinions are actually two sides of the same coin. They're elements of the same process. If we go back and look at our Toolman model, your opinion is actually the claim, and your facts are your data. Okay, this is, I mean, when you say statement you want the audience to believe, this is an opinion you want the audience to hold. That's another way of saying it. And your data, which is verifiable evidence that this opinion is valid, well, those are hopefully factual in nature, that you are presenting. So they're part of the same unit here. So you shouldn't think about the world as well, that's just your opinion. Well, okay, that's the conclusion that somebody reached, hopefully based on thorough fact, and looking at the facts. Because that's what an opinion is used to describe, is a conclusion that someone has reached based on what they've observed, that in theory other people could also observe and they would see the same thing. One of my favorite phrases I had from one of my professors, um, in educational philosophy, was the idea that people are equal, but their opinions are not. Sometimes people form opinions based on invalid reasoning, and that would be called a logical fallacy. Um, and so you can't really weigh those opinions very highly when you are evaluating controversial and important topics. All right, and hopefully that, and I think as I look at the material that you're turning in, you are all doing a pretty good job of choosing relevant, controversial things, at least things that you're passionate about, that you want to share with others, and have others kind of share your viewpoint. And that's what a persuasive speech is. And you want to make sure that your opinions are equal. Not just equal, but maybe your opinions are superior because you have superior facts and sounder reasoning than perhaps people who are criticizing your ability. Your ability. Let's hopefully they don't do that. That's a particular kind of fallacy that we'll talk about later. They're criticizing your position. Um, so, what are some features of a good fact? So, facts that are well developed, that are worthy of being used in decision making and therefore in persuasive speeches, kind of have some can share a lot of qualities. But these are the ones that I think you really should look for, or that we're really talking about as a society when we talk about facts. First, facts need to be verifiable. That means that anybody can go to that source, read it, and come to a similar conclusion, or get the same information out of it. Especially if you're now, I know a lot of us don't necessarily are using science, literally science experiments for our speeches, but a lot of the world, not just in science, but in social science, in business, in marketing, they want to form, they want to have certain definite when they develop the basis of what they're doing or the basis of what their business strategy is, just for example, in marketing. And in order to do that, there are certain facts that you have to be able to verify through a variety, and by various I mean a variety. They actively apply different methods of trying to get that same information. Um, to see if it's consistent, right? So if you're in marketing, for example, people will use a focus group, a survey, and maybe interviews. All three of those methods of trying to get what the quote unquote facts are related to their product, why people buy their product. A famous example would be Coke and New Coke. Um, Coke felt that they had a good list of facts, and it was a fact that every time they had a survey, they had blind taste tests, and they had focus groups. Everybody agreed that New Coke, which they hadn't named yet, so people didn't know they were planning to replace the classic Coke, which we now enjoy. Um, they everybody was of the same opinion that, hey, this is the better drink, and that opinion or that conclusion became, factual because it was just so verified. And that's sometimes how people get confused about facts versus opinions. Is that in some ways, a lot of the big ideas, a lot of the big conclusions that we reach as a society, um, really their basis is very basic. Like we'll talk about flat Earth and the world being round for reals in a moment. I don't want to spoil that discussion, um, but the facts or the observable things that kind of fuel our society are very basic. Does this taste good? And then 90% of the people, of the thousands of people that you've talked to, all of them say yes. That's that's really verified. Um, you can also have a good fact. It should have just similar perspectives, arriving at similar descriptions. So I kind of went over that already. You're trying different sources, sources that maybe have different aims as groups. So it's kind of it's kind of noticeable. For example, we had a debate. I'm again one of the coaches on the debate team, and so one of our debate topics was about the minimum wage. And we found an article from the Cato Institute that supported the idea that the minimum wage should be raised in the year 2016. And of course, we had Bernie Sanders that was also of the same opinion. Now, the Cato Institute, for those of you who may not know this connection, is named after Cato, a very famous, very fanatical ancient Roman politician who was of the conservative faction during Julius Caesar's time. In fact, he was so conservative compared to Julius Caesar's liberalness of the day, um, that he basically blew up what would have been a power sharing compromise, and that started the chain of events that eventually turned Rome into an empire led by Caesar's nephew, Augustus. But anyway, leaving that history lesson aside, the idea is that, okay, so when you name yourself the Cato Institute, there's a certain perspective that you have, and I think a lot of us, even if we don't pay attention to politics, we're kind of aware that Bernie Sanders has a very different viewpoint and ideas from society from someone who describes themselves as conservative, right? And yet they seem to agree on the same basic idea that the minimum wage as it is now is not sufficient. That actually is really good. Um, Using those two pieces of evidence can be used as factual. In other words, that there are facts that seem to indicate, again, that maybe certain that the conclusion, a valid conclusion, might be that the minimum wage needs to be raised, right? Um, but even facts don't necessarily. But here's the important part: facts don't necessarily form a judgment on its own. The best facts don't have any kind of evaluative judgment in them. So a fact would be the best kind of fact would be, um, for example, saying that in both Bernie Sanders' argumentation and in the Cato Institute's argumentation, they realized that they had two statements that are very similar that you could verify easily through a variety of ideas or through a variety of methods. And that was that many cities across the country were raising their minimum wages on their own without action from the federal government. And even though their perspectives on why that phenomenon was happening were different based on their different viewpoints. One being conservative, and the other being, democratic socialist. Um, they came to they observed the same phenomenon and described it the same way. And if you just look at those statements without their claims, you would have to agree, because it is true that New York raised its minimum wage. It is true that San Francisco raised its minimum wage, right? You can verify that through any source you want, through either using the Cato Institute, through using Bernie Sanders, through looking at the government, through looking at newspapers. Like, you could arrive at those. You can see that phenomenon happening on your own. Um, so, but and so good facts don't necessarily have judgment. Rather, they are, again, pieces of information that you use to create judgment, to create opinions. So, features of a good opinion, then, that our opinions, again, are conclusions about the world, and they are influenced by things that you believe. All right, then, and belief is something that you accept to be true. Um, they are influenced by your attitudes, which is kind of like an emotional reaction to things that are going on, and they're also influenced by your values. I will say here, as a quick aside here, that a lot of people say they value the same thing. And it's not that they don't value the same thing, it's that people have a different order or priority for how they value things. Like, if you asked any person on the street whether they value life, they'd be like, well, yeah, I mean, I want to keep on living. Um, and you ask enough people, they will have that same conclusion. Um, until maybe you meet somebody who is, um, for example, maybe they are in a lot of pain. Maybe your random sample has included somebody who is in the critical care ward of hospice, and they're kind of, to put a euphemism on, they're on their way out. Um, and they might be saying, I do value life. I like to be living, but my quality of life is so poor that I'd almost rather it be over now than to face, months of this kind of suffering that I'm going through, right? And it's not that because they don't value life; it's that they value quality of life higher than simply seeing another sunrise. All right. And now, for some of you, maybe that value or that attitude makes a lot of sense. For others, it doesn't. And again, where a lot of persuasion happens, this is the thing I really want you to remember, is that you can influence people's beliefs. Like, you can influence what people believe to be, they accept to be true. You can't really influence their attitude. For example, in my family, one of my nephews came out as being gay. Um, and so he worked really hard with his mom to get her to believe that it was just the way that he was. But her underlying attitude about that change was such that she still didn't like it, right? She believes, like, okay, I accept that my son is this way, but my attitude is that I don't like that he's that way. um, so, that's something that so beliefs are easier to change than attitudes. Attitudes are easier to change than values. Generally speaking, you can't really change somebody's value unless they have some kind of experience. It doesn't have to be a traumatic experience, but a lot of research kind of comes to the conclusion that you just kind of have to live life a bit and experience different things before you can adjust somebody's value. You're not going to be able to do this um, in the course of an 8-minute speech. It's just not going to happen. But you can probably get people to believe or accept certain things as being true during an 8-minute speech. And maybe if you do it enough, over enough 8-minute speeches, you can affect somebody's attitude. But that's slower still. So anyway, a reasonable goal for your real persuasive speaking would be to maybe alter what people think is true, as opposed to how people feel about that truth, versus how people will prioritize certain things in their lives. Um, so okay, that's how opinions are kind of filtered out, though, right? So you have this kind of lens on there that has beliefs, attitudes, and values, and this is how people reach their conclusions. Um, Now, all opinions, filtering through these ideas, they do use facts. And again, facts should be agreeable to most. Like, if I pull up a bunch of sources to you from the government, various politicians, and so on, you can see that cities across the United States, to go back to my minimum wage example, are raising the minimum wage on their own without the federal government asking them to. All right, like you can agree to that because there's just so much demonstrable, verifiable information out there that's saying that's happening. Right now, people can still interpret that differently because some people would say, well, good, that means we shouldn't raise the federal minimum wage because people are already doing it. Therefore, we don't need to have a one-size-fits-all policy, right? And that opinion is based on someone's beliefs, attitudes, and values. Now, somebody else could look at that information and say, wow, if all these cities are doing it, there must be something about it that makes it attractive. I think we should at least look at more information and see how this would benefit our community instead of just kind of reaching the conclusion that we don't need to do anything because action's already being taken elsewhere, right? So again, that kind of line of thinking is, again, influenced by people's beliefs, attitudes, and values. So you can use the same information and come to nearly opposite opinions about what's going on. And that's just kind of how the world is. A lot of people like to say, well, it's a fact that we should raise our minimum wage. It's like, well, that's kind of so much, that's kind of too much of a conclusion to rise to the idea of a fact. But again, all opinions should be based on facts. And eventually, if an opinion has enough facts behind it that most people can agree to, and it fits in with beliefs, attitudes, and values shared by a critical mass of people, that opinion can become a fact. In fact, again, the scientific process is kind of based on that, in which if they test hypotheses, which are unproven conclusions, enough and it's consistent enough, and it's not that people agree and that's what makes it a theory or a fact. It's that there's absolutely no other way that it can go. They've discovered that there's no other way this phenomenon could ever work out. um, then it becomes a fact. And at some point, it started itself as an opinion that people were trying to support with data and using warrants to kind of link that data to the conclusion or to the claim. So anyway, a good opinion also is not really speculative unless it's heavily qualified. So there's a lot of people that want to be very definitive in their language, but the reality is that inside their head, they're not very sure. And it's always the best, most intellectually honest way to indicate that uncertainty in some way, using words like unless if you feel like there's a circumstance in which your statement is not true. If, again, if there's a circumstance under which your statement is not true, you should describe that with using an if phrase. In my previous experience, if this is something that you're basing on your experience, then you need to say so. And the idea of maybe, right, that there's a certain amount of speculation or probability that is there. Now, some people do go the opposite direction a little bit, and they don't indicate that their conclusions are as strong as they are because they're thinking, oh man, if I really come out as hardcore raise the minimum wage in Indianapolis, I might lose some people. So I'm just going to say that, but I'm going to prefix it with maybe or if or unless. So it is based on your own judgment, but you shouldn't base that judgment based on how you think people will react. You should base that judgment based on how um, solid, how verifiable the facts are that you've used to make your opinion, and how certain you are in those warrants that you've attached to those data. Um, there are some things that are truly maybe, like you don't really know, but there's maybe evidence that indicates it's a certain way, but it's not, quite a conclusion yet. It's again intellectually honest to say maybe instead of making a very broad, very not very broad, but a very definitive statement when you're not quite sure. Similarly, if you are quite sure, if you've got 50 sources um, and they're all from different perspectives, and they're all saying the same thing. They've all done different experiments or whatever, um, and they all come to the agreement. Then it's probably not time for maybe. It's time to just say this is how it is, right? Um, so that's kind of my rant about that. So let's look at actual fallacies now that maybe you've heard about or kind of read about if you've gone ahead and skipped around the book a little bit. So fallacies, what fallacies are, again, is a mistake in logic. But one of the things that makes them a true fallacy is that fallacies sound reasonable, which is what makes coming up with good examples so difficult. Because a lot of times, in order to demonstrate, for example, ad populum um, uh, a fallacy. We might appeal to a trend or a fad that has since gone out of style. But the reality is, those aren't the ones that you have to worry about because they seem unreasonable, and because they are unreasonable. For example, if I made the claim that we should all bring back, oh man, um, I might need to explain this to you. Back in the day, there were these things called Jinko jeans. You can still find them on the internet, but they were really popular with my generation and around middle school. And there are these, if you have any, and it's maybe a bad example because I have to go back to even further to things like parachute pants, or they're pants with huge leg openings. Okay, these Jinko jeans, just enormous, like 50-inch leg openings. Okay, that's larger than a human waist, even if someone is very, very large. Okay, um, and that's the leg opening. All right, so these were just ungainly things, and people thought they were just awesome, just the most amazing kind of pants. And you can make this as, well, that's kind of an ad populum fallacy. You're saying they're great pants because they're so popular, not because they actually form the function of pants particularly well. Right? But people to that line of reasoning, they were blinded to it because they'd look around the world and they'd see tons of Jinko jeans being worn by all kinds of folks, right? And they'd be like, if this were bad pants, then no one would wear them, you dingberry. Um, right? And that's kind of the ad populum fallacy, because that line of reasoning, if these are bad pants, then people who need pants wouldn't wear them. That seems to be very reasonable because they're like, look around the world, buddy. They're just, everybody's wearing them. If they were bad pants, no one would wear them. But they were bad pants, and people realized that rather quickly. I think they only lasted maybe 2 or 3 years. And on the scale of human fashion trends, that's not very long. um, but but because people were just so about how reasonable it seemed that if people were wearing them, then they couldn't be bad pants. They must be functioning as pants well for somebody. And so that's kind of the problem with kind of making fallacies, is that I know that a lot of you, unless you like look up Jinko jeans, or live through this time, live through this time with me, that doesn't really make any sense as a particular fallacy that people have. So anyway, the ad populum, man, I got so excited to explain to you what Jinko jeans were. I think I just totally forgot to explain what this was. I apologize. Ad populum is the logical fallacy, that something must be true because it is popular, right? You can kind of see it in there. That's the Latin term, ad populum. Um, but it's appealing to popularity is maybe another way to phrase it. So this must be true because so many other people think it's true, or this must be true because so many other people are doing it. That kind of reasoning, right? And again, it sounds reasonable. Maybe another example that might be better for you is Crocs. I made the argument that Crocs are really poor shoes. That was the claim or the opinion that I wanted people to share with me by the time I was done. My data, my evidence was that, if you go outside in Crocs into a wet environment, they don't keep your feet dry. They tend to fall off if you're doing any kind of strenuous activity. Um, and honestly, if it's too hot outside, they'll start to kind of melt a little bit. They don't really protect your feet. And what shoes do is protect feet. Now we're going into the warrant part. If a shoe's job is to protect feet, then Crocs are really poor as shoes. But then you get those people that are like, well, you know what? If Crocs were bad shoes, people wouldn't buy them. Obviously, there must be something about Crocs that make it good, make it a good shoe. And even a well-articulated person would say, well, Crocs are a good shoe because they're comfortable, right? To which I would reply, but a function of a shoe isn't necessarily to be comfortable. That's kind of gravy on the top of it. They're supposed to keep your feet safe, right? And then and around you can go. But the idea here is that, someone saying, Crocs are popular, therefore they must be good shoes. That is an example of ad populum. It seems reasonable. Maybe it seems reasonable to a lot of you, but it isn't quite. It isn't quite reasonable. Then, of course, we have the ad hominem, which I'm sure you've heard before. This means like at the person. in Latin. It's an argument that, or rather, it's a statement that you try to get someone to disbelieve someone else because of some kind of character flaw or some kind of perceived lack of experience, as opposed to what their idea really is. Um, so, for example, um, I'm trying to think of one. Um, Again, because a lot of these things seem so reasonable to people, it's difficult to make a good one because if I make one that is, like everybody's like, well, yeah, duh, that's obviously a fallacy, then it's a poor example. But if it's a good example, then maybe a lot of you would be like, well, that's not a fallacy. I believe that, which also makes it a poor example, right? Um, so anytime you hear somebody say, well, of course you would say something like, um, okay, here's just a common example in general. If you've watched Parks and Recreation, you know there's the mother loving sugar company that is in the local community. Um, and in addition to saying a lot of things that like add populum, like, well, if our products were bad, then people would stop eating them, right? That kind of idea. But they'd also say um, things like, well, of course, Leslie Knope would have a problem with mother loving sugar. She hates anything that's popular. Just look at her stance on something else that's popular, right? Or just look at how sloppy she is. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but during that series, Leslie Knope came to blows with the rhetorical blows with the mother loving sugar company that was the big business in the local community, and they attacked her character relentlessly. Talking about what a sloppy person she was, and she wasn't really a sloppy person, right? That's part of the ad hominem attack is that you just try to cast someone in a bad light, and therefore that somehow reflects upon their position, right? Um, the problem with ad hominem attacks isn't that it's attack on someone's credibility, and honestly, there are times where someone's credibility is important when you weigh their decision, because if someone's been demonstrated to be a liar so many times, it's like the boy who cried wolf, right? You just can't trust them regardless of what they're really saying, and there's a lot of effort that goes into validating somebody's statements, and if they don't make reliable statements very often, you're basically asking us to roll the dice as opposed to being able to be trustworthy. But ultimately, we would say that we shouldn't. Every time someone cries wolf, we should go checking for the wolf. We shouldn't leave it alone. Um, because there's nothing about someone's character or someone's propensity to lie that necessarily makes the statement they're making now untrue, right? And that's really the moral behind. See, I had a pretty good example there in that fable, right? There was really nothing about the boy's propensity to lie in that story that meant there wasn't a wolf, right? Other than the fact that he lied about it so many times. But that's not actually an actual indicator that there isn't a wolf there at this time. The only indicator you could figure out to see if there really was a wolf or not was to go check, right? That would be the valid way of deciding if there was a wolf or not. Instead, it was an ad hominem type decision. They're like, you're just so unreliable, not credible. I'm not going to listen to you. And then the boy got eaten, right? And in a lot of ways, that's one of the many lessons you can learn from that fable is that, especially about important things, it doesn't matter how many times someone's been wrong before. Like the only way to be sure is to check. Um, and that's kind of the conclusion I want you to reach as well, at least in terms of these speeches. Um, if you can demonstrate that someone is wrong, then do it, and that's a valid argument against what they want. Um, or what they're saying. But unless you can demonstrate that they're wrong in a verifiable, demonstrable way, you can't say things like, well, this doofus was lying about this, that, and the other. No, sorry, you've got to check for the wolves each time. That's how to do it without a fallacy. Um, Sometimes people make an opinion based on or a conclusion based on what they call optics, which is what the situation seems to be, and they won't bother to investigate. Um, Again, the boy who cried wolf was a great idea on that. It's just the idea that this person's been wrong so many times before. Do we really need to invest effort into figuring it out? No, we don't. And then something bad happens. Um, then we also have this idea of common sense. the truth lies outside common experience. And this is something that doesn't really have a Latin term or a really good explanation, but there are things in the world that, like the world being round, that you wouldn't see in your day-to-day life. A lot of the arguments that center around, the basic argument that centers around like the flat earth believers really boils down to, take a look outside your window. Does this planet look flat to you? Does this planet look round to you? No, it's flat. Done, right? The only way that you could really kind of combat this idea is to do really what the ancients had done. There's a really famous experiment done using Euclidean geometry in ancient Greece, in which, um, in order to explain certain things in the world, like why people on the eastern coast of Greece reported that they woke up earlier in the day than people on the west side of Greece, yet they could travel east to west and extend their day. How is that possible, right? Because in theory, if you're riding horseback and everything's flat, the day should end and begin in the same number of hours, but you can artificially extend the length of your day. It didn't take them very long to figure that out just by kind of common feeling. And then they used hourglasses, this very regular um, shifting of sand from top to bottom while they traveled to kind of verify that, yeah, you know what, it does take longer for the sun to set when you're actively traveling east to west from the east. So what the heck would explain that? So they synchronized, and one of the oh gosh, I've forgotten him now. He's famous, but he's not famous like Socrates famous. He's famous like, well, like Euclid famous in mathematics. But anyway, he created an experiment in which they synchronized their times using hourglasses and other timekeeping methods. And they measured the angle of the shadow at a particular time of day at the same day. And using the differences in the angles from around these various points in Greece, they used, well, they just kind of crunched the numbers using what they knew about geometry, and they realized that the only shape that could create a difference in shadow angle at the same time of day, um, to this degree, the only shape that makes sense is a sphere. Um, and so they didn't necessarily know exactly how the Earth was shaped. Like people say now it's more like an egg because of the way that the gravity works and things like that. But um, they felt that it was definitely spherical, definitely round, if you use the colloquial word, right? So the ancients even knew that, and that wasn't earth-shattering news. When in the Middle Ages, when Galileo and Copernicus were all talking about those kinds of ideas and the models of things going around the Earth, or rather going around the sun as opposed to the Earth, a very ancient people knew those basic ideas. Um, their problems were more religious in nature, in that um, they were interpreting the scripture when they shouldn't have been. It's really fast. If you go look up the actual Wikipedia article, the long one on those people in the Middle Ages, the beef wasn't that they came to such unorthodox conclusions. The beef was that they felt it had implications for divinity, that as non-priests in Catholic countries, they were not authorized to start interpreting the scripture when that was something for a clergyman to do. In any case, that rant kind of over. The point here is that there are some things that are true, definitely true, but in order to demonstrate that to somebody, you have to go way outside of their personal experience. And let's be honest, I think a lot of us, not to harp on this flat Earth thing, but the world will keep spinning whether or not you believe the Earth is round or flat, right? It's not something that's going to really impact your daily life, but um, and that's very difficult then to, if somebody's really invested for whatever reason in believing the Earth is flat, it's going to be almost impossible to demonstrate it to them unless you like strap them to one of those high atmosphere weather balloons so they can go way up there and and look at the curve of the Earth themselves from several miles up, right? Unless you do that, that's probably the only real way that you can get someone to actually see the curvature of the Earth for their own eyes. Um, so unless you're prepared to do that to convince someone of that, then you just have to kind of accept that they maybe won't, and that's going to be that's difficult to deal with in your speeches if you're dealing with something like that. Um, we'll talk about how maybe to avoid some of these things in the future here. So I'll stop ranting about that and go on to the non sequitur. The non sequitur is a term, a Latin term meaning like the argument doesn't follow, or rather that the warrant and the data just they don't make sense together. Sometimes it's because there's a coincidence. So, for example, if I hear a lightning strike outside and then my dog barks, um, I come to the conclusion that my dog barking is because the lightning happened, or rather, my dog barked and made the lightning happen because they happened so close together, right? It's just kind of a coincidence, or it's a mix-up of the causation, right? And that maybe the lightning struck and that made my dog bark, but they happened so quick I couldn't really perceive it. So by coincidence, I got it wrong. I got the order wrong, but I'm just kind of piecing things together in what seems to be the other way. Um, Correlation is the idea that certain things are correlated or related to each other. There is a reason why. So, for example, I could make the claim that ice cream causes. I can't really make this claim. This is the logical fallacy, but I make the claim that ice cream causes murder. And when you look at two statistics, one is the statistics of volume of ice cream sold in the United States, and the other statistic is a number of opportunistic murders in the United States. You'll notice that those two rise together. Therefore, they cause each other, right? Well, no, not really. There's no biological evidence that says that ice cream drives someone into a murderous rage. But they are correlated, and I'll explain why. There was a famous kind of to demonstrate this idea of this fallacy is that um, they are related in that when warmer weather comes, people who are looking to maybe mug somebody or attack or assault somebody, they have an easier time because it's more they can stalk their prey outside without being frozen during the summer. And also when people are hot, they're buying more ice cream because ice cream makes you colder. So there is a relationship between these two ideas, but they're not causal, right? And one doesn't cause the other, but they have this common relationship in the idea that both things are facilitated by a rise in temperature, right? And it's really the rise in temperature that is facilitating both those ideas. So it's just a coincidence that those are things that are related, and you could demonstrate a correlation between those things because of that coincidence, but they don't cause each other, right? In order to have something that says this causes the other thing, it has to be very observable, right? You have to like watch someone eat ice cream, watch their brain change, and then watch them kill somebody. And hopefully, you wouldn't do that because that's a terrible experiment. Because you wouldn't want to, do something where an innocent person would get killed. But nonetheless, that's the kind of proof that you would need. Um, in any case. And finally, we arrive at the granddaddy of all of these things, which is the idea of hasty generalization. And the basic idea here is that you arrive at a generalization or a conclusion that you feel you can apply to almost every situation without any evidence. You are hasty or you're quick to arrive at that conclusion. I have one piece of evidence that says, I have one statistical study that connects ice cream to murder. They both rise at the same time. So therefore, anytime someone eats ice cream, there is just an increased chance that murder is going to happen. Right? That's a hasty generalization. Right? You're not taking the time to connect the dots and looking at all of the various pieces of evidence that might be related to those two phenomena. Um, Similarly, and that's just kind of the like I said, that's the basics of it. And this doesn't really get more complicated than that either. Hasty generalization is just you have one piece of evidence and you just blow it out of proportion to make a universal conclusion. And you need 50, 60, 1,000 pieces of evidence. Grander claims, grander opinions require grander evidence, is generally how it goes. So if you have a big, huge conclusion, then you need big, huge evidence. If you have a little conclusion, you can get away with one or two sources that are decent, and walk away with a belief, something you can accept to be true. But the more cosmic your claim is, the more evidence you really need in order to make it believable. So how do you avoid making these fallacies? I've gone on quite a while now, and we're gonna wrap it up. So popular things are popular for a reason. So why might that be? So again, talking about why things are popular. Why might parachute pants and Jinko jeans? Why were those popular? Um, Maybe it has nothing to do with them being particularly good pants. Why are Crocs popular? It probably doesn't have anything to do with their function as shoes. Um, this might allow you to say, okay, there is something going on here worth investigating that I can either use to support my speech or my position on something, but I can't just leave it at it's popular, right? There might be a reason why it's popular, and that reason might be what I really want to talk about. Next, you can maybe measure your claims in some way. So, don't just rely on the Cato Institute's opinion or Bernie Sanders' opinion. I mean, depending, I suppose, on your politics, you're predisposed to accepting one opinion over the other. But you can measure it objectively. Again, objectively meaning that using information that doesn't actually form a conclusion by looking at the declared minimum wages across the country, right? And that would be the best way to measure that idea, right? You're measuring it. You can't really fake it. It's something that anybody can do on their own time, and they would see the same information. They may not arrive at the same opinion, but they can still see the same information. Um, you could also, again, to talk about, talking about ad hominem. Why are you credible? All right. Maybe I do speed on I-69 on occasion, but you know what? That's not a reason to disbelieve me about logical fallacies, because I have a lot of experience as a debate coach talking about, not just talking about this kind of thing, but giving people practical advice about how to deal with them. And my team's very successful. I think that's because they respond well to what I have to say. Again, I don't want to feel like I'm taking credit for their work. It's all them, but I say things, and good things happen as a result. So maybe I'm credible in that way. Um, how would you answer your critics? Might be another way that you might say something like, some people might say that Crocs are good shoes because they're comfortable. Here's what I have to say about that. So that might be another way to build your credibility, um, and avoid that kind of ad hominem type thinking. Is there a simple way people can check information for themselves? So this kind of goes to the common sense idea, um, you know, and this is kind of difficult. But in the end, I chose that example the way I did with that geometry experiment with the shadows. Because if you have a friend that lives even in just a different portion of Indiana, you don't really need to go very far. Um, and you measure the angle of the sun at, say, high noon on the same day, and you crack open your Euclidean um, geometry textbook or the primary copy of the elements that's been translated, and you can run the same kind of tests that they did, and realize that the only surface that those measurements make sense on is a sphere, right? So that you could do that in theory. Um, and there's plenty of YouTube videos out there if you want to Google that, that will tell you how exactly you and your friends can verify that yourselves. Anyway, also assume that people might doubt your source too. So I don't usually, so like during debate, during that minimum wage debate, we didn't just leave it at a quote from Bernie Sanders or as a quote from Cato Institute or even as a quote from both of them. um, right? We found another way that we could demonstrate how people, rather cities, were raising their minimum wage over time without relying on the opinions of people that you might say are credible, right? Like there is other ways to verify that information. So assume they might doubt your sources. Is there a better way to verify your information other than simply Googling those sources for you, right? Is there a different source? Is there a different method of looking at that information? And then finally, do sources or maybe people with opinions with different beliefs, attitudes, and values, do they seem to confirm or at least the basic information that you've used? So even though they might disagree with the conclusion, is everybody that's talking about your topic, do they kind of have the same information and they're just kind of interpreting it differently? So a good example, again, might be that minimum wage debate, right? Where everybody just kind of agrees that the minimum wage is $7.50 across the country, but it's not in other highly populated areas. Everybody's saying that, They might have different opinions about where to go with that information, but everybody's using those same basic facts to support their ideas. And if so, then that fact is probably valid then, right? And you can then talk about it and say, look, these two people that typically disagree are all agreeing on this one piece of information, right? That actually really does build credibility. Another way to think about it, especially, is if people change their mind. Um, Really credible sources, um, if they're presented with new information, will change their mind over time. The Cato Institute again is a good example. Didn't really mean to get this political about minimum wages today, but it is a good example of logical fallacies and credibility. The Cato Institute again is very conservative. They're historically been very opposed to minimum wage increases, um, and um, they were very opposed to it in 2009, but suddenly, for whatever reason, in 2016 they had changed their conclusion, and the reason why is, according to them, was because the economy was changing. um, Now the Cato Institute has since kind of backtracked on a lot of that stuff. Um, and there's reasons for that too, because they were also getting, at least the claim goes, they have more information now about these tax breaks and how maybe federal regulations aren't required, blah blah blah. But the reality is that they received different information and they changed their conclusion, and that really should be the way it is, right? If somebody asks you to reconsider something and it's like 2 seconds after you form your opinion, the conclusion you reach should be the same, right? Similarly, if you reached a conclusion 4 years ago and you now live in a different place with different people and different needs, maybe your conclusion about what appropriate behavior is going to be different, right? And that actually builds credibility, because that means you're changing your viewpoint, you're changing your conclusions based on the information that you're being presented with, and that you're not either being stubborn or being hasty and generalizing things, right? You're actually looking and being considerate about the verifiable information, the facts that you're presented with, and as a result, when those change, your opinion changes, right? And that really should be the way it is. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox now, and I've been going on for 51 minutes. I promised you a short video. I did not deliver. I am so sorry. Um, your assignment. You have a lot to work on, in a way, but really the broad basic assignment that I need you to do this weekend is to finish up all those surveys. You need to finish up your main points, and then this week on Wednesday, I want to collect your final outline. That means you have your introduction and conclusion with your main points together, and all your sources should be there this time. All right, so uh, tonight and into the week, I really just wanted to collect your rough draft. Rather, I'm sorry, tonight at the end of the weekend, I wanted to collect kind of your rough draft, just main points, so that you know what you're talking about. This week, you're gonna give me your, in midweek. You should give me your full outline, and I'll write a little announcement about that. But that's all I really need from you, is basically to take your speech from wherever it is now and move it on to the completed phase where you're ready to record. We're not going to quite record them yet. There's a little activity I want you to do with your full, complete outline before you actually record. So don't record it just yet, but I do want you to finish up the writing of your speech this week, midweek. All right. And again, I know that Wednesday is the 4th of July. So, and I just realized that because I'm a doofus. So I'll probably have to adjust that. Again, I'll write out an announcement so you don't have to go fishing through the video for this information. Okay, thanks again for paying attention. This was an extra long one, an extra rambly one. I appreciate your attention, and I will, quote unquote, see you on Wednesday.